So I will call the meeting to order. Hope everybody is safe and well and had as good a Thanksgiving as humanly possible, given the constraints that we were under. Last meeting, we had a really full agenda. We didn't cover all the topics, but I want to thank Andrew, if he is on, for sending us, Andrew Jackman, I hear you. I want to thank you for sending us both the white paper that was really interesting on the data links, and also the video, which was wonderful, of all of the staff that was presenting at one of the healthcare conferences. So thank you. If you didn't have a chance, worth seeing. Thank you, Ray. The agenda is a little shorter today, so we should cover everything. We're going to start with the approval of minutes. For those of you that looked at the agenda, you might have said, why are we approving two sets of minutes today? I am pretty sure in September we did approve the June minutes. But we discovered that on video meetings like this, one has to do a roll call. So I'm going to ask that everybody approve the minutes via a roll call. When I call your name, say yes, I know, and we'll approve both sets of minutes. But first, let me ask, is there anyone with any questions, concerns, changes to the September minutes? Okay, hearing none, I will get my glasses. And let's see, Rob Birmingham.
Yes.
Great. Ray.
Yes.
Bill.
Yes, good with me.
Eric Gold.
Yes.
I don't see you. She on? No. Lauren is being replaced by Amy. Is there Amy Bianco on? Nope. Niels.
Yes.
Thank you. I knew I saw you. Cassandra.
Yes.
Yes, there you are. And Meredith.
Yes.
And Lois Johnson.
Yes, on behalf of David Seltz.
Behalf of David Seltz. Terrific. So, approval of minutes. Thank you very much. So recorded. I'm going to now let Ray take over the agenda items. I'm going to turn it over to you for all three of the next one. If we're going too long in one of them, look over and you'll see me waving. But otherwise, we've gone through the amount of time we want to spend on all of them. So thank you, Ray.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Faye. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see everybody. We have an interesting agenda this afternoon. There's a lot of things going on at CHIA. As you can imagine, it's very busy for us in light of these circumstances in the wider world. So let's get to it, and we'll get through the agenda. So first, actually, do we want to switch to slide view? Alex, I'll defer to you as to when we're in slide view versus when we're in speaker view. All right, great. The first slide is a high-level agenda. Actually, I'll just quickly tell you, we've now done the approval of the prior meeting minutes. As Faye said, we had to approve two with the motion as opposed to just one because of the requirement for a roll call. The executive director's report, which you're about to hear from me. And then after that, there are two very interesting presentations. One on our recent behavioral health and readmissions report, and the second on our insurance enrollment trends report. And I should mention that in the executive director's report, I'll actually be turning it over to Andrew Jackman for, he'll be doing an update on CHIA's work to support the COVID-19 command center. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of, I just wanted to give a quick update. I didn't prepare any bullet points, but I wanted to give a quick update on CHIA's remote operations, just to say that things are going very well. You've heard me report before that our transition to remote operations was very smooth and strong. That continues to be the case. We're doing all of our legacy activities. We're doing a lot of new work for the command center. We're preparing for a bunch of new activities coming up very soon. And so from an operational standpoint, CHIA is doing quite well. We do head into the winter, with a real focus on the next couple of months possibly being very difficult. We've been devoting a lot of time and attention trying to think about our workforce and what we can do to keep them engaged and feeling, sort of good about their work, good about just the circumstances they're in. I think work looms a little bit larger maybe when you're just stuck in your house all the time. I've seen some studies that say people are spending more time on work. So anyway, we want to make sure that that we're doing everything we can, particularly over the next several months, which promise to be tough. But so far, the switch to remote operations has been, as I said, very smooth and strong. In addition to all those activities that I mentioned, I should say we're doing a lot of replatforming at the moment. It'll actually be nice to be through with all of that work because number one, it'll be a force multiplier. A lot of these new platforms we're bringing online will have a lot more power than the systems that they're replacing. But we're also devoting a lot of time and attention on our IT team to these different projects that are required. But so we've moved out of our data center and are transitioning essentially all of our operations to the cloud. We're in the process of, we have decommissioned the Netezza server that we've been using for I think 6 or 7 years as our primary vehicle for hosting the APCD for our internal access to the data because it's such a large data set. We'll be moving that to our IBM partner. We've been doing a lot of other sort of replatforming type activities. So normal operations are going well. A lot of replatforming activities are continuing at the same time. And as I said, we're doing a bunch of new work for the command center. The last thing I'll mention on this topic of remote operations is we did survey our staff in the fall to see how they were holding up, how they were doing, to get their feedback on different aspects of remote work. And I want to actually thank Lois and the HPC. I believe that our survey, we took a look at a survey that they had done of their workforce, and we patterned it after that. And I won't share all of the results, and we wanted to keep it confidential because it was really an internal view of the thing. We promised the staff that it wouldn't be shared externally, but the Oversight Council, I think, is CHIA, and I can report sort of at a high level 3 really interesting questions. They were the first 3. One of them was, overall, how is remote work going for you? And to that, 88% said very good or somewhat good. 8% were neutral, and we only had 4% of the workforce that said somewhat bad or very bad, which corresponded to, I think, 5 people in the survey. We had an almost complete response from the workforce, which is also a very interesting indication, high level of interest. It wasn't as if, only a couple of people responded. Pretty much everybody responded, but 88% said that remote work is going very good or somewhat good. The next question was, in regards to your general well-being, how are you adjusting to the new normal of the pandemic, both personally and professionally? And to that, 74% said very well or moderately well, 21% a more neutral assessment, and then 5% said moderately or very poorly. So let me just, I won't try to interpret that for you. Those are the numbers. And then third, actually, this was an important one. We asked people to respond to this question. I am able to be just as productive while working remotely when compared to my usual work location. And this is a self-assessment, so it's only a data point, but 85% strongly or somewhat agreed that they could work just as productively remotely as they could in the office. 9% were neutral on the question, and 5% disagreed. So anyway, we found the survey results to generally be validating in the sense that people weren't saying they didn't have the tools to work remotely. They weren't saying they were not able to communicate with team members. I mean, you can imagine many problems that would emerge from a survey, and we were happy that those didn't seem to be the case. So anyway, so that's it for, unless there are any questions on CHIA's remote operations. I guess I would summarize it by saying they're going well, but we head into the next couple months needing to have, I think, a lot of focus. Then hopefully after that, we'll be in a much better place with a vaccine.
Yeah, Ray, quick one. Did you see any patterns like between like types? Did you guys between like type of position or type of job, like potentially for like maybe the 21% or the 5% that were dissatisfied, or was it kind of like all over the place?
I don't, off the top of my head, I can't play it back to you, but yes, we do have, we generally looked at the results rolled up so that it would be, there'd be no way to tell who was answering them, but right. There is, it was possible, I think, to break down by, certain breakdowns that would let you, if, for instance, look at, well, who is it that, not who individually is unhappy, but are we talking about managers? Right. Are we talking about unionized employees? Get some general, that information was available, through the survey, but I don't happen to know it off the top of my head.
Okay, thanks, Ray.
Before moving on to the rest of the agenda, I think it's worth just quickly talking about, this is something I've done previous meetings since we went remotely, but I think it's worth kind of remembering, because we just talked about CHIA's remote operations. our operations often express themselves through our data sets, although you could also very much say that our operations express themselves through our analytics, the different analyses and publications we produce. So you can look at the organization from either end, but it's a shorter list to look at our data sets. And what you'll be hearing from today, for instance, you'll be hearing a really interesting report on the behavioral health and its impact on hospital readmissions, as I mentioned. Well, that's going to use our case mix database. You'll hear other things where we're talking about accelerating our data collection, and it's these primary data assets that these updates and reports relate to. So I just wanted to kind of briefly tick through for each people, kind of the current state of these data assets, and in particular to what's up in light of COVID-19 and healthcare equity issues. So case mix, we'll talk a bit more about this in a little while, or Andrew will talk about it, but we've gone from producing an annual version of case mix based off quarterly reports. We've actually now moved to monthly voluntary collection and monthly creation of reports around case mix. And just, I think within the last week or two, we rolled out a new regulation to make monthly case mix mandatory. So this is something that has gone from essentially an annual view of hospitalizations in the state to a monthly view. So a dramatic acceleration. This is a really great data set for studying a whole lot of things. Things that happen outside the hospital, it's not good for at all, but for something like COVID, where it's happening heavily in hospitals, it's a great asset because it's very strong data, very clean data. It has very strong race and ethnicity data, for instance, which is important. So anyway, a really important data asset that we use a lot, and you'll hear more about that a little bit later. Provider finance, this is another crucial set of data assets that CHIA collects. We actually collect financial data from lots of different types of providers, but hospitals and their financial condition is something that's been much in the news and something that people are very interested in because of the pandemic and the impact it's had on the healthcare system. I think the council members have received the pre-release copy of our hospital financial report, and I think it's not yet publicly released, or it's actually, Emma, can you remind me, or Andrew, somebody, is it public yet, or is that only a pre-release versions we've shared?
It's being released tomorrow.
Released tomorrow. Okay, so tomorrow we will release a look at hospital finances. It's the third quarter of the fiscal year report, which means it's data through the end of June of 2020. But it's very rich data because it's year to date. So it shows everything that's happened in the hospitals since the start of their fiscal year last fall, the fall of 2019. So it's 9 full months of the fiscal year. So it's a very large sample set. It includes a big chunk of the pandemic because it goes through the end of June. And because it's our quarterly reports, it includes information not just about the hospitals, but about the whole health system, including affiliated physician groups. We've been doing monthly collection of provider financial data on a voluntary basis to get a quicker look at what's happening to the finances of hospitals. But the quarterly data set is much richer. And as you heard, we're about to releasing tomorrow, the most recent picture of the hospital finances. So a very important function. The Mass APCD, a critically important tool. We're upgrading the platform. You heard a report last time from Deb Scheel on the work that we're doing. We won't do an update this time because we won't update each time. We'll do another update next time. The project continues to go well. That's going to be a really indispensable platform for understanding a lot of the things that are happening with COVID because of its extraordinary flexibility and its ability to drill down on lots of different things. The APCD is going to be very important for the work we do going forward. Payer aggregate data, again, is just such a valuable tool for us. It's how we produce our annual report and take a look at total healthcare expenditures in the state. But it's really able to do so much more than that because it breaks the expenditures down, or we're able to break expenditures down by type. So in the past, that's meant inpatient, outpatient, physician services, pharmacy, things like that. But starting just this month, we are now collecting for the first time payer aggregate data that reports on primary care spending and behavioral health spending. And so other states have looked at primary care spending. I believe we're the only state that's doing a behavioral health spending analysis. So the data is coming in now, starting early next year. We'll be able to start looking at primary care and behavioral health spending in the state at a level of detail we've never been able to do before. And then lastly, our survey data. Last time you heard, although it was truncated, Christine Loveridge gave you an update on our health insurance survey. You'll actually be hearing from Christine again today. She's not at the end of the agenda, so it will not be truncated. But you saw some of the, from the last time, some of the uses we put, or some of the capabilities of our survey data, which is really quite strong. So anyway, just that quick summary of our data assets, because as we go forward, different things will come up about APCD or case mix or provider finance or payer aggregate data. And I just wanted to summarize some of that for you. Next slide, please. All right, and then lastly, before turning it over to Andrew, I just wanted to put this in the context of, I always like to think in terms of what CHIA's priorities are and make sure that it's a short list that fits well together. Our priorities are to be able to continue doing CHIA's core operations because those data assets I was just talking about, they're very important, particularly in a time of a pandemic. The measurements that CHIA can do with its data are important, not just for the analyses we do, but for the analyses that other agencies do. So we're very keen on continuing our core operations uninterrupted, even though we're working remotely. And then to the maximum extent possible to support the work of the COVID-19 Command Center. And you're just about to hear a report on what we're doing there, and you'll see that we're doing a great deal. It's really, I find it somewhat amazing that we're able to do everything we were doing last year from an operational standpoint, plus all of this new work for the Command Center. And I think the future looks more like now than it looks like last year. I mean, I think the current level of intensity isn't going to continue forever, but I think there will be many things coming out of the pandemic and our response to it that will make the CHIA in the future look more like the kind of rapid turnaround ad hoc analysis type of CHIA that we are now, and not as much like the standard reporting or exclusively standard reporting that we did previously. So core operations, supporting the Command Center, continuing to bring the APCD project to the finish line. It is such a critical project. It has such long-term utility for the organization. We don't want to lose sight of that. So I always call that out as its own special thing. And then lastly, and this is somewhat new, as much as we are really straining for bandwidth, like it or not, we will soon have to start producing analyses that relate to the impact of COVID-19 on the healthcare system, on healthcare equity. And there's a health reform bill that's in conference right now that will presumably be coming out before the legislature ends for the year. And that would have a bunch of new assignments for CHIA. So we need to be starting to think about how we can handle all the things I just mentioned, those first three priorities, while also taking on some new work relating to COVID-19, healthcare equity, and health reform. Next slide, please. Right, so that's the end. I realize I have not done the finance update, so I will circle back to that, but let me just pause because that's the end of the executive director report other than the finance update. That's just, that was really just a framing exercise, if you will. And I think that what Andrew's about to talk about and the things coming after that, is really the meat of things. Briefly to touch on finance, which is always, as I carry, there's often not much to report on, and then things all happen sort of in a rush, and then there isn't anything to report on for a while. So I'm trying to remember where the status of things exactly in September when we met as to whether fiscal 20 had been officially or not officially closed out from CHIA's perspective. We worked with A&F to access some capital funding, as people are aware. That's been part of our budget strategy each year. So I think it actually hadn't quite happened yet. So I can report to you now that we closed fiscal year 20 with a balanced budget. And we're now in fiscal 21. The fiscal 21 budget is in conference. And so we don't yet know what the full or remainder of the year's budget will look like. We're extremely gratified that the governor recommended a very significant budget increase for CHIA of $3.7 million, and that both the House and the Senate went along with that. Presumably that means it's not conferenceable, but never say never, certainly not in 2020. So we're going to just sit tight and wait and see what comes out of the final budget, and then we'll be working on fiscal 21. But this is the last year of our CHIRTF payments, and we will again balance the budget, and we'll keep you informed on how we do that. Cassandra, let me offer you the opportunity to say anything further, but there really isn't a lot more to it than that. But if you have anything you want to offer.
No, that covers it. Like you said, we're all eagerly awaiting the conference budget, but I think you gave a good synopsis of the state of affairs. Thanks.
Great, thank you. All right, so I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew. I think the next item is right. He's going to talk about CHIA's work to support the COVID-19 Command Center. I should point out this isn't everything that we do. By the way, there's also, and I know one thing that didn't make the list because it's sort of more of a work in progress. We're doing an analysis of the factors that are associated with COVID-19 infection and mortality at nursing facilities. And so we've done a facility level analysis, and we're still working to get additional data to do a person level analysis. But that's a really important kind of use of CHIA's data and some of our high-end analytic expertise to try to look at some of the actual drivers of what's happening of infection and mortality. But Andrew's going to talk to you about some of our more sustained kind of ongoing operations types of work for the command center. So, Andrew.
Great. Thank you, Ray. Council members, it's great to see all of you again, albeit virtually. Alex, if you could just move us to the next slide, please. As Ray has really said, CHIA has continued to prioritize doing everything that we can to help meet the Commonwealth's pandemic response needs. And what you see on this slide, again, as Ray said, are really some of our more ongoing and persistent efforts. In addition to these, there are efforts that are under development or kind of one-off needs that we are working to meet. But this kind of gives you a sense of broadly the three categories of activities that we have endeavored to take on to help meet the pandemic response. And they are, firstly, increased data collection efforts. Secondly, increasing the frequency and timeliness of our reporting. And third, very broadly, I would describe as leveraging our staff resources, our expertise and relationships to help our sister agencies meet their needs during this very trying time. So I think council members will recall that we had provided an update on this work at the last quarterly meeting. And so many of the items on this slide should look familiar, as a lot of this work has been ongoing since the spring. I'm happy to provide a refresher or answer any questions about any of them. But specifically, there have been a couple updates since the council last met. These are items that are highlighted here in orange that I would like to call your attention to and just provide a little more detail on. So first, early on in the pandemic, CHIA had worked with hospitals on a voluntary basis to increase the frequency of their hospital inpatient discharge data submissions and to move those from a quarterly submission to a monthly cadence. At the time, we had a pretty generous compliance. I think we had, at the height, 15 hospitals that were submitting data on a monthly basis. And that represented about 25% of the acute care hospitals in the system. So we were very grateful for their compliance with this. As of November, however, we have moved to make these monthly submissions of preliminary data mandatory. And what this will do is allow CHIA, the Department of Public Health, and others who rely on this data to really have a kind of systematic view kind of across the board of hospital trends in a timely way. So our first data collection was at the beginning of November. The requirement was announced at the very end of October. So we are expecting that the December submission, which is due next week, will be where we really start to kind of see this information trickling in or coming in a meaningful way. Secondly, because nursing facilities have really been a focal point of the pandemic response, CHIA has been working with the Executive Office of Health and Human Services and the Department of Public Health and others to help collect some new information about staffing levels and resident days from nursing facilities that are participating in the Mass Health Program. And again, this information is being used by the Executive Office, DPH, and others to help monitor facility performance and then activate and manage interventions. And then thirdly, later this week, CHIA and the Command Center will be hosting a webinar with hospitals to discuss a supplemental data collection that will allow us to capture some COVID test results in order to better understand the prevalence of COVID hospitalizations. So this was data that we could not capture through case mix, and so we're working with the hospitals to get this information through a monthly supplemental collection that will go into effect early in the new year. So those are the three kind of updates since the last quarterly meeting. Again, I'm happy to answer any questions that the council may have. Otherwise, I think this is work that we expect that will persist and likely expand throughout the duration of the state of emergency. So we will continue to keep you apprised on any developments here.
Thank you. This is very nice. I guess I have a question from the reporting side. What are we doing on the digital front? Reports that we can even just people logging into their cell phones, information there to really understand the cases, where they're happening, where the hotspots are? Or are we doing something? And if so, what would it be?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Aya. And I think there's a lot of work to understand precisely where those hotspots are. Massachusetts has a very robust contact tracing program. That work is being led out of a dedicated COVID response command center that's being led by Secretary Sutters. Amy Bianco is here today kind of representing EHS as a designee. So she may be able to speak more generally to the efforts of the command center, but those are precisely the type of issues that this group of people has been working day and night to get a handle on. And as a lot of that is included in some of the public reporting that's made available weekly through DPH. And CHIA's role is, where possible, to bring to bear our data resources to support insights into those type of issues.
Right.
Yeah.
It's sort of a, yeah.
Go ahead, Ray. Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to speak over you. That is sort of a key distinction. We're actually playing more of a back office function than like a lot for CHIA's kind of legacy work. We're the publisher, whereas for a lot of the stuff that we're doing for the command center, we're really like a in-house analytics shop, and we're not publishing the data. In fact, we're handing it off to DPH or to the command center or to others, and then they are incorporating. There are dashboards and other public dissemination things that are happening through that channel. But so I think instead of having it come out from multiple different places, I think we're really kind of more of a conduit for the data to other internal people like the command center. But I don't know, Amy, if there's anything you want to add from a HHS perspective.
That's really good. And just before we go to Amy, and I think it would be interesting as being the backend analytics, helping connect the dots, right? So the data coming from the command center to what might be going into the hospital systems and connecting that full circle would be super interesting and I think super valuable. Amy, go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you, Andrew and Ray. I think that you articulated it correctly. I mean, well, first of all, I know at the command center, we're incredibly thankful to have CHIA support because we're often throwing many, many rapid turnaround analytics requests at all of you. So thank you so much for your support on that. In terms of public reporting, yes, as Ray mentioned, the command center has a combination of daily, weekly, bi-weekly public health reports that are posted on the website. I think there's always areas to improve in terms of how we are getting that data translated into a very accessible, readable, digestible way. And so I think that's probably more that's more so in the communication shop, not necessarily my expertise area, but I can assure you that people are constantly thinking about, while we have all this very rich data, how are we getting it into the hands of people who need to know it the most to inform the proper response?
Can I ask for Ray or Andrew, do you know or anticipate if CHIA will play a role on the data front with regard to vaccine distribution and the immunizations?
Fascinating. It hadn't occurred to me. I don't know. I mean, I
imagine DPH can do it, but it's also going to be an enormous data task over many months.
Great point. Right. I think, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it, but right. I think you just summarized it. It would really typically be a DPH function, but just in light of how many things are happening and how much pressure there is on everyone, and possibly stranger things have happened. So maybe we ought to be thinking about that as well. When I say that we're getting ready to think about things down the road, maybe we should be thinking about, but no, excellent point. But no, so far, no, we're not aware that we would have a role.
Andrew, I just wanted to quickly clarify. You were saying that this month you guys are switching to mandatory collection for all those monthly reports, right?
Specifically for the inpatient discharge.
Inpatient discharge.
Yes.
Okay. And I know this is my continued obsession with like the data pipeline, but are you anticipating like any, have you seen any issues like with these hospitals reporting like when they switch to mandatory, or are you anticipating any compliance issues?
No, I mean, again, our process is to kind of, make folks aware of these upcoming requirements so that this has been vetted and we've worked through the issues with them. This is data that they are producing kind of on a monthly basis anyway,
Right.
And have been submitting on a quarterly basis, which would allow them to kind of do some final true ups. So all we are simply asking is that they give us the kind of preliminary data sooner than they would otherwise. So from a production standpoint, we don't anticipate any issues. Our systems are prepared to ingest and make sense of that. So kind of there should be no issues there. I've not heard anything about the first month going sideways. And again, I think because of the timing of this, it's next week is when we'll really start to have this information start rolling in.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew.
And I will say, so we've done some preliminary or done some reports for the command center for EOHHS on the monthly case mix data. And, as they request changes, I'm sure these things will evolve, but case mix is a really, really rich data source. It goes back decades. It's very well understood. It's extremely well populated. All the race ethnicity fields are filled out. It covers every single solitary hospitalization in the state, regardless of payer, regardless of, it's a very complete and rich data set. And so it's going to let us take a look, especially when you start tying it to COVID test results, which we're about to do. It's a really, really rich asset for understanding the pandemic and how it's playing out in the state. So things like comorbidities, people that had COVID, what else did they have? Did they have, what was the prevalence of hypertension or whatever? We can look at just all the other hospitalizations unrelated to COVID. How much did they change over the time frame? I mean, we have a really detailed, granular look at hospital services and the patients that received them. And so turning it into a monthly report is really a big step forward. So a lot of good work went into it.
Great. Well, if any of the council have questions that they think of after the fact, we're kind of always available and happy to answer anything that comes up. So thank you. And again, great to see all of you.
All right, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, if they occur to you afterwards, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to fill you in on the different work that we're doing for the command center. That's a lot to sort of throw at you in one slide, but yeah, it's a lot of interesting work. And there's starting to be themes that are developing, and it's something that we keep emphasizing here, is that it's not easy, I shouldn't say, but there's a tendency to want to solve. Typically, there's a question you want to answer, there's data, and the two don't quite go together the way you'd like them to. And so there's a tendency to solve that by having a smart analyst scramble and either fix the data or do some things. What we're trying to do is increasingly move those corrections upstream, that instead of having analysts do it, as much as we can bring a computer science approach, so that if we can fix a problem by having a smarter intake, or we can fix the problem by when we're building the databases, if we can stamp it with certain information, instead of leaving it to the analyst phase, which is a really limited resource, we're trying to automate as much as possible these different data challenges that are being thrown at us. So it's the turnarounds are so fast, we are finding that we have to scramble too, and not necessarily do things in the formal, precise way you'd like to, but as much as possible, we are trying to, almost as a CHIA differentiator, not just be yet another group of people that are scrambling on these things, but to try to really focus on how we can use data operations to improve kind of the state of the data and make things easier for analysts, and then disseminate from there. So anyway, you'll hear more about, excuse me, you'll hear more about what we're doing for the command center at the next meeting, because I'm sure there'll be more to talk about. Okay, so I think that brings us now to the two presentations that we're going to have at this Oversight Council meeting, and they are both, I'm looking forward to them. I think they're really rich and interesting issue areas. In this first one, we're going to be hearing again from Christine Loveridge, who was at our last council meeting, speaking to us about the health insurance survey, and we kind of ran out of time at the end, unfortunately. So it's nice to have Christine back for a return visit. And I'm trying to think with Christine is going to be Hong, right? I'm looking around. Is Hong going to be with you, Christine? Or perhaps not?
I think I'm on my own. Zia.
There you go. I didn't want to not introduce her if she was with you, but great. So anyway, let me just briefly say this report, I find this such an interesting one because the title talks about readmissions, which is an important topic in its own right. But in order to understand the impact of behavioral health on readmissions, you first have to really almost do a survey of behavioral health prevalence in the case mix data, kind of among the people that are in our hospitals. And so to me, the impact on readmissions is fascinating, but what this is also is a really comprehensive snapshot of the people that go into hospitals in Massachusetts. What are the substance use and mental health conditions that they have? And what are the demographic characteristics of the people that have them, and so on. So there's just a wealth of information about the behavioral health crisis that we have in the state. Doesn't show the whole picture, but it shows the parts of it that have emerged into a hospital. So with that, Christine, take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ray. Thank you so much to everybody. So good afternoon. And again, my name is Christine Loveridge, and I'm an associate research manager in CHIA Strategy and Research Unit. So today, as Ray mentioned, I'm going to present highlights from CHIA's work on behavioral healthcare and inpatient hospital readmissions. So we can go to the next slide. So first, I'm just going to provide a brief overview of CHIA's work in general on the readmissions and revisits reports to Massachusetts acute care hospitals. I'll then share some of the key findings from our latest report, which was published in October on behavioral health and readmissions, covering discharges in state fiscal year 2018. And then there's a little bit of time at the end for any questions and answers. So next slide. So let's start with the introduction to our work on all payer readmissions and revisits in the Commonwealth. So CHIA currently produces 4 products focusing on all payer, all cause, unplanned, hospital-wide readmissions and revisits in Massachusetts acute care hospitals. So for all of these 4 publications, we use in common a measure of 30-day hospital readmissions or emergency department visits that CHIA has adapted from a measure developed by CMS. It's the longtime contractor, the Yale Center for Outcomes Research. So the Yale CMS methodology was originally developed for the Medicare population. It has been adapted by CHIA for the all-payer population. And the core of our reporting is our annual statewide report focused on inpatient hospital readmissions. Along with our statewide report, we also publish hospital-specific profiles on an annual basis to provide a deeper look at the patterns of readmissions in individual hospitals and to provide comparisons as well to similar hospitals. Complementing our inpatient readmissions work, we also produce a report on emergency department revisits, which are when patients are discharged from an inpatient hospital and subsequently return to the ED within 30 days, but are not actually admitted again as an inpatient. And then finally, we publish a deeper look on behavioral health comorbidities and their associations with inpatient readmissions and hospital length of stay. That's what I'm presenting on today. So moving to our new report. I know obviously all of us have been hearing a lot and talking a lot about behavioral health care recently, including mental health conditions, substance use disorders. Here in Massachusetts, even before the pandemic started, about 1 in 4 adults had at least one behavioral health condition. These conditions are especially prevalent among the hospitalized population. So as you'll see today, nearly half of Massachusetts adults hospitalized in state fiscal year 2018 had a comorbid behavioral health diagnosis. And considering the deep importance of behavioral health conditions and strong associations with post-discharge health outcomes, providers are currently required to consider behavioral health comorbidities in the discharge planning process. CHIA has been monitoring the prevalence of these conditions and their associations with hospital readmissions. Since 2016, we have published statewide reports on behavioral health and inpatient readmissions using data from our hospital inpatient discharge databases, so one of our case mix databases. This is our 3rd statewide report on the topic. Next slide. So one final thing before I jump into the findings. I want to very briefly explain what I mean by behavioral health comorbidity. because it is a little technical. So when we report on behavioral health comorbidities, we're first of all focusing on the inpatient adult hospitalized population. We look at the diagnosis information from the discharge itself, as well as the diagnoses for all other hospitalizations in Massachusetts for the same patient over the previous 12 months. So there was a 12-month look back period. Looking through all of that diagnostic history, we categorize patients into 4 mutually exclusive comorbidity groups: those with comorbid mental health conditions only, those with comorbid substance use disorders only, those with both of these types of comorbidities or comorbid co-occurring mental health and substance use conditions, and those with neither of those types of comorbidities identifiable from the hospital discharge records. So now I'll just walk through some of the key findings from our latest report. So as you can see in the blue wedges on the right here, we found that in state fiscal year 2018, about 45% or close to half of hospitalized adults in Massachusetts had at least one comorbid behavioral health condition. Nearly 40% of all patients had some sort of comorbid mental health condition. By far, the most common types of mental health comorbidities that we saw in our data were anxiety disorders and mood disorders, which include depression and bipolar disorders. About 1 in 6 had a comorbid substance use disorder, the most common of which were alcohol and opioids use disorders. The darkest blue wedge that you see in this pie chart here shows that more than 10% of all adults hospitalized in Massachusetts had comorbid co-occurring mental health and substance use conditions. And we'll come back to that population again and again. Right. So as in previous years, we found a strong association between the presence of these behavioral health comorbidities and much higher rates of readmissions. On the left, these 2 bars here, you can see that patients with any behavioral health comorbidity, shown in that darkest shade of blue, were twice as likely to be readmitted to the hospital as those with none of these comorbidities, shown in that gray bar on the far left. On the far right, in that sort of medium shade of blue, you can see that for the population with comorbid co-occurring mental health and substance use conditions, the readmission rate, 26.8%, was about 2.5 times as high as for those patients who had no comorbid behavioral health conditions. I also don't have the data slide here, but in our report, we show that these patterns of elevated readmission rates hold regardless of the reason for the initial hospitalization. So when you think about all of the top conditions, sepsis, heart failure, COPD, and so on, the presence of these behavioral health comorbidities along with whatever they came to the hospital for, that presence of the behavioral health comorbidity was associated with substantially higher rates of readmissions across all of those top conditions. Okay, next slide. So we also report on variations in these patterns of the prevalence of the behavioral health comorbidities and their associated readmission rates by a number of patient and discharge characteristics. I'll just present 2 today. So patient age first, and then I'll go to payer type. So looking first at the prevalence of these conditions by age group, you can see here that at least 1/3 of patients in every age group has a behavioral health comorbidity. And in fact, the majority of hospitalized adults below the age of 65 and 60% of patients below the age of 45 have at least one of these comorbidities. Both mental health and substance use disorder comorbidities were more common among younger age groups, particularly patients who had comorbid co-occurring conditions. Okay, next slide, please. So when we take those age groups and look at their readmission rates, you can see that the rate of readmissions for patients with any behavioral health comorbidities, shown in the blue bars, was substantially higher, across every age group compared to those without behavioral health comorbidities, shown in the gray. The difference between these cohorts is especially striking among the younger age groups. So patients aged 18 to 44 were 3 times more likely to have a readmission if they had a comorbid behavioral health condition than if they didn't. Right, next we can look at payer type quickly. So moving from left to right, for the major 3 payers in Massachusetts, you can see that 62% of discharges with an expected primary payer type of Medicaid, including Mass Health, were for patients who had at least one behavioral health comorbidity. For Medicare, the prevalence was 42%, and for commercial insurance, 40%. Now, considering that at least 2 in every 5 discharges across all of the 3 major payer types had some kind of comorbid behavioral health condition, you can see that this is very much an all-payer issue. However, it should be noted, looking at those darker shades of blue in particular, you can see that that Medicaid discharges were disproportionately likely compared to other payer types to reflect comorbid substance use disorders, and especially comorbid co-occurring conditions, shown in that darkest shade of blue here. Now let's look at the readmission rates by those 3 major payer types. So starting with the gray bars on the left, representing the readmission rates for patients with no behavioral health comorbidities, and the darkest blue next to them, which is any behavioral health comorbidity, you can see that across all 3 major payer types, the presence of these comorbidities was associated with at least twice as high a rate of readmission. For Medicaid, actually the rate was more like 2.5 times as high. Now, although there are absolute differences in readmission rates by payer type, and as you might expect, you'll see things like the Medicare has a higher overall readmission for that population, readmission rate for that population. When you look at the rates for patients without any of these comorbidities, the Medicaid and commercial populations actually look fairly similar. 7.9% rate of readmissions for Medicaid versus 6.5% for commercial. It's not really until you look at the patients with behavioral health comorbidities that you see that divergence in readmission rates. So 20.1% for Medicaid versus only 14.7% for commercial. Looking over at the right side of this chart, which from left to right again shows readmission rates by comorbid mental health conditions only, substance use disorders only, and then the comorbid co-occurring conditions, you can see that the comorbid co-occurring population had by far the highest readmission rates across all the major payers. Among patients with Medicaid, those with comorbid co-occurring conditions had a readmission rate that was more than 3 times higher than for those who didn't have any behavioral health comorbidities. Next slide, please. Right, so finally, although I focused so far on readmissions, we do also investigate one other outcome in our report, the hospital length of stay. So looking at the 2 bars on the left again, you can see that the patients with behavioral health comorbidities, in darkest blue here, stayed on average 1.4 days longer in the hospital than those that didn't have any of those comorbidities. So 5.7 days with any behavioral health comorbidity versus 4.3 days without any behavioral health comorbidities, shown in that gray bar. And these differences, again, I don't have the data in front of me, but these differences also held regardless of the condition that led to the initial hospitalization. For all of the top primary diagnoses, sepsis, heart failure, COPD, and so on, we saw longer average lengths of stay when behavioral health comorbidities were present. Next slide, please. Right, so lastly, just to recap a little bit. First, we found that 45%, or pretty close to half, of all adults hospitalized in Massachusetts had at least one comorbid behavioral health condition. For Medicaid adults, that figure was 62%. We also found that inpatient stays were on average 1.4 days longer when behavioral health comorbidities were present. The presence of these comorbidities was also associated with a much higher rate of being readmitted to a hospital within 30 days. Patients with behavioral health comorbidities had readmissions at a rate twice as high as those who didn't have any of these conditions. Finally, we found that the difference in readmission rates was higher among some subpopulations, particularly those with comorbid, co-occurring mental health and substance use conditions, those with a primary, with an expected primary payer type of Medicaid, and patients aged 18 to 44. Patients aged 18 to 44 with any behavioral health comorbidity and Medicaid patients who had those comorbid, co-occurring conditions both had readmission rates that were more than 3 times as high compared to patients with none of these comorbidities on their records. Right. With that, thank you all very much for your time. And I have a few minutes to take any questions you might have.
Christine, this is Bill. Super important work here, obviously, on such a such a complex area, as we all know, and particularly when you focus on kind of the needy and most vulnerable in our society. So interesting analytics. So this is year 3, right? So that was for fiscal 18. So a little dated, unfortunately, but maybe 2 questions with regard to kind of timing. What does it look like longitudinally, 16, 17, 18? Are we improving? Are we worsening? I suspect it's the latter, but curious what the data shows. And we all know, of course, that behavioral health conditions kind of make every other condition worse. So I was curious if you have any insight into how kind of the presence of BH exacerbates, other conditions. But how can we accelerate more current data capture, kind of in particular, of course, 2020, to try and see if the impact of COVID, if we could tease out how that has impacted behavioral health conditions?
Sure. So great questions. Thank you very much. First, regarding the longitudinal question. So with the runs that we have so far, we're seeing fairly stable, but yes, slightly worsening rates, both an uptick in prevalence. I believe the initial report that we had a roughly 40% prevalence rate, and it's now about 45% for these behavioral health comorbidities. And there's also a very slight a slightly closer association between the presence of those behavioral health comorbidities and elevated readmission rates, especially in certain subpopulations. So yes, the picture is getting very slightly worse slowly. So regarding the tightening of the data pipeline, it is certainly our hope to be able to turn this data around as fast as possible. And now that we've been doing it for a few years and have our own programs as much developed as possible, and a lot of the other parts of the process, like developing visualizations for the reports, some of those aspects can be made a little bit faster. But for us, one of the major sticking points is that because our methodology is adapted from a measure of readmissions created by CMS and their contractor, and they update their readmissions methodology every year to account, for example, for changes in ICD-10 from year to year and other additional clinical data that comes out. There is a pretty long lead time between when the data is initially created and when we receive their programs that they have finished modifying, and then when and also we have to make our own additions and adaptations to reflect the all-payer population and so forth. But yes, we absolutely are very, very interested in speeding up that as much as possible.
Christine, in thinking ahead to how we saw a fairly significant admissions drop during the COVID era, can you give me a little feel of the implications of that with regard to our ability to process data or our ability to produce insights from that data?
So I don't think that, well, I think maybe Ray is actually a better person to be able to take this question. But I do not think that it is an issue of data processing, at least from CHIA's perspective. The case mix data that we work with to produce this report has been, we normally get it on a fairly regular schedule, and in fact are getting it faster with the monthly data that we're starting to get in. And so we should be able, there is no technical reason why we can't be running that as soon as possible, provided that, we have the correct programmatic updates from year to year based on coding or other methodological changes.
Right, so we haven't seen that sort of a suspension in the, I know that other reporting has been suspended or put on pause, or so we've not seen that sort of thing happen in terms of the data for us.
Right. Yeah. No, we've been very well. We have paused some data collections, but this report Christine, this is off of case mix, right?
This is all from HIDD. That's correct.
Yeah, sorry. So this is from our hospital discharge data, and that, because it's literally decades old, it's a pretty well-developed set of muscles. We checked with the hospitals, and I think we might have given them a month delay initially or whatever, but this is one that they're able to do pretty regularly. And as I said, we're accelerating now. We used to collect it quarterly and produce an annual view. We're now collecting it monthly and doing certain things monthly. Now, we wouldn't do a hospital readmissions report monthly because it's not the type of thing you sort of look at that, this is the type of thing that an annual look is probably sufficient, or maybe twice a year. But there's other things you probably do want to look at, much more rapidly. And I think that's what we're going to sort out now that we have this capability to do monthly data collection, monthly reporting, is what is it that people care about? What do they want to see? And also, what does the data support? Because some things, like I said, it's probably just not valid to look at it monthly. You really need to see like a quarterly, because of just the variations that occur. So we're going to be trying to understand those things going forward as to what we can produce and what we should produce with this data.
Thank you.
You bet. All right. Oh, I know. I had a question for you, Christine. I know that the full report does go a bit more into demographics, but I suspect the world's going to insist we go even further. So can you talk to me about what we do and maybe what we ought to be thinking about in terms of, the rain does not fall equally, on everyone in this particular case. I suspect there's some pretty significant variations in who has these behavioral health conditions and where they live and so on and so forth. So what do we know about race and ethnicity? You showed us a slide that talked about age and payer, but I think if not now, in the future, we're going to need to say where they lived, at least at a 5-digit zip code level, because not all zip codes are created equal. And I think ideally at an even more granular level, but also demographic characteristics. So I know some of that's in the report, but could you just maybe speak a bit to what we can and what we can plausibly do in the area of teasing out who is suffering these problems?
Sure. So the case mix data that we work with has zip code level information in terms of geographic units. Currently, what we do is we roll that up and report that at regional healthcare regions that are defined by the HPC. So I believe there are 15 regions, and we do have that in our report. So in terms of geography, that's the information that we have available. There has been some work that CHIA has been doing as well to provide geocoded locations of the case mix data that would be even more specific than the zip code level. I don't personally imagine that would be something that we would want to report on at kind of that level of granularity for this type of report. But certainly, we would be very interested in what potential smaller geographic units we could provide in future years, if provided that we can make that information aggregated securely. So in terms of what do we do currently report on? Obviously age group, gender, payer type, region of patient residence, and again, those breakdowns of common discharge diagnoses that I had mentioned a couple times in the presentation. We certainly have race information in the case mix data, and when we are reporting, we have a report also coming from our same unit later this month on HIDD specifically that will be providing overall reporting on racial demographic information in the case mix data. With respect to behavioral health comorbidities, I think it's very likely that future cycles will include that information, yes. So we do have quite a bit actually of detailed information about race groups in the case mix data.
I get the feeling that the more of that we can focus on, provide, ask for, do whatever it takes, that should be something to come out of the pandemic, that we don't revert to the old ways, that we in fact use that as a transformative moment to get better at understanding the gaps.
Absolutely.
Totally agree with that. Just to echo it, or maybe think a little bit about kind of beyond, zip code. We all know how kind of inaccurate, right? And arbitrary zip code groupings are. So I think anything we can do to pierce that, which you kind of alluded to, Christine, we should be doing that, too, right, in concert with all the racial information.
Yep.
Yeah.
Second that.
Yes, and CHIA has been actively working on providing much more detailed information, at least internally, on geographic information, providing actual coordinates where possible to geocode all of the information in the case mix database. And then, what ultimately we are able to do with that is pretty flexible.
It's, as I said, CHIA is thinking about this issue itself, but the truth is the world's going to push us, beyond that. And so, we'll have to respond. So, I mean, the Attorney General just last week, I think it was, or maybe the week before, but had a public event unveiling a report with some recommendations that they did around health equity and those issues. And it had a number of recommendations that related to data. We had had an opportunity to see those. We fully support everything the Attorney General wants to do, but I think that there's going to be, CHIA has done its sort of level best up until now in light of sort of the way the world was and the balances that sort of people want it to strike. I think that there's more urgency, there's more attention, there's more whatever. So I think we'll pressure test some of the old assumptions. I think some of the things we thought we couldn't do, we'll find out that we can. But we're aware that this is an area that we have to devote more attention to and do a better job in. But we've got a good base and a good foundation. There are real legal issues federal legal issues that we just can't get around, it turns out. I mean, as much as I try to say, really, can't we just, it's like, no, turns out there's really some hard stops in all this, but we are trying to be creative and working with, for instance, the Attorney General's office or other entities that creates more opportunities than just CHIA with its own authority. So, we're doing what we can, and I think that you can expect us to be doing a lot more and better in the future. And I didn't want to dismiss what we're doing now. We're doing a lot of good stuff now, and we're going to do more and better in the future.
I wanted to ask one more question just to make sure I understood correctly in regards to the comorbidity definition. Is it that the primary diagnosis was a medical condition, but they had comorbid mental health conditions? Or was it that the primary reason could have also been a mental health condition?
Yeah, so the primary diagnosis on the discharge itself of the sort of the index discharge can be anything, including a mental health or substance use condition. And so again, this is, as I had mentioned, it's a little bit technical, but to keep sort of fair comparability to other medical conditions, we actually don't include the primary diagnosis on the discharge itself when calculating behavioral health comorbidities. So we would look at secondary diagnoses, all secondary diagnoses on the discharge itself, and then all primary or secondary diagnoses for the 12-month look-back period. So any other hospitalizations for that same patient in any Massachusetts hospital when calculating the behavioral health comorbidity. And so that in practice, virtually every discharge that has a primary diagnosis that is a behavioral health related condition also will get picked up as having a comorbidity. There are very few where you only see them once in a 12-month period and they happen to have a primary behavioral health diagnosis and nothing else. But yeah, that is the way. So that is the way that it's defined in the YLCMS readmission methodology. The way that they do every comorbidity is that way. And so we are using the measure that they developed.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Christine. That was wonderful. And if folks have other questions that occur to them afterwards, please feel free to reach out either to me or directly to Christine. Happy to continue the conversation virtually, but that was really, really wonderful. Thanks for the great work, Christine.
Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to turn to our second and our last presentation. This is on trends in Massachusetts health insurance enrollment, the monthly enrollment monitoring. This is another area where, and this is a very interesting, it's a good example of CHIA being CHIA. Lots of other states have entities that measure any particular aspect of their healthcare system. CHIA kind of uniquely, or Massachusetts uniquely among the states, pays a lot of attention to knitting together pictures of the entire system. So our enrollment report isn't just looking at the fully insured population. It's not just looking at self-insured or Medicare or Medicaid. It tries to pull all this together, and we need to use multiple data sources to do that. And it takes a fair amount of sophistication to pull it off. And we've got great people working on it. This is another thing that we've accelerated from, I think it was a quarterly look, but with the economic impact of the pandemic, we've accelerated to do all of the work involved in producing these analyses on a monthly basis so that we can see the impact on enrollment. And in the first couple months, not a lot was happening, but the kind of the cumulative impact of the months and the trend lines are starting to emerge. And so it's important that we monitor this on a very close basis, and it's good information. So with that, I want to turn it over to Greg Wheeler and Lauren Almquist to talk about our monthly enrollment trends report.
Awesome. Thank you, Ray, and thanks everyone. And Christine, that was a really fascinating presentation too. So thank you for that. My name is Greg Wheeler, and along with my colleague Lauren Almquist, we're going to be talking and giving a quick rundown on the agency's efforts to monitor insurance enrollment during the pandemic. First, some brief background on the work being performed in this area, and then we'll discuss some findings from our most recent report. So since 2014, CHIA has reported on enrollment trends twice per year, I think even less frequently than Ray said. And we, with COVID, definitely needed to adjust our approach in order to produce more timely outputs because there was going to be significant shifts in the market that we wanted to capture. So since July, we've been generating streamlined monthly analyses with the purpose of rapidly summarizing shifts in enrollment across key market segments. So that's been our approach. The most recent edition, which may have come across your inbox, was published last Tuesday on November 24th, and it reflects enrollment through September. This reflects about 6 months since the governor's state of emergency declaration. So it's actually a good distance into the pandemic to kind of look at the trends that have emerged. It's worth noting the work we're doing in this space is done in coordination with a few other agencies that hold specific programmatic and market oversight roles. So the Division of Insurance, the Health Connector, and Mass Health. And I say that just because it's a really necessary resource to help us understand the full picture. But also if we or you have more specific questions in these specific domains, we have a standing forum available to us. So that's very helpful to have. And sorry, just one more point on the data sources. You can see that we draw from a number of them, primarily the ones listed on the left. And this is really necessary when we do try to piece together a comprehensive picture of the market. And it's also worth noting too that we have been able to do this work really with no added burden to insurance carriers. That's something we've been really mindful of when we've embarked on any sort of new analysis during the pandemic. And what that has meant just that the team working on this project has been really adaptive in getting these publications out each month. All right, next slide, please. So jumping into some findings, what this chart is really taking a step back, a 30,000-foot view of insurance enrollment in the state. And there's kind of two takeaways from this slide. The first being that overall insurance coverage of about 6.4 million has remained mostly steady during the pandemic. And I think this is something we would like to assume would be the case, but with 2020, there's nothing that really can be taken for granted. So we want to make sure that that's kind of acknowledged. The other point is that there has been notable movement at the insurance category level during the pandemic. As you can see, kind of two consecutive quarters trends in Mass Health and commercial declining by 2.1% and Mass Health increasing almost 10% since March. And really, you usually need to dig several layers deeper into insurance categories to see swings like that. So I know it doesn't pop out extensively on this chart, and we'll dive into some more charts that do kind of convey the magnitude of these shifts. But I do think that that's kind of an important perspective when we're really stepping back and looking at the full market. So next, we're gonna identify some finding from each of the insurance categories, and we'll start with commercial. So there are a number of ways to view the commercial market, which covers about 4 million people in the state. And we do have multiple breakouts in the publication, kind of at the end. There's a number of tables there. But in this edition, we specifically wanted to highlight employer-sponsored insurance, which comprises the vast majority of commercial coverage. So this slide is meant to put into context the relationship between employment data and the decline in ESI coverage during the pandemic. I will preface, I'm not a labor economist, so apologies in advance if I go too far down that. but I think it's a really important, necessary relationship to put into context. So the story here is that in the spring, employment levels, as we know, fell dramatically, the large blue bar on the left. And while ESI coverage also declined 0.5%, which isn't insignificant, clearly, not at a corresponding rate. But as employment levels have begun to recover over the summer and into the fall, ESI has continued to decline, and by September, it has dropped by 2.3% since March. So there are a number of reasons for this. I think what we're seeing kind of a dampened and delayed impact on ESI levels. But the easiest way to think about it is that initial job losses were overwhelmingly temporary in nature. And I think we heard a lot about that, and they were impacting disproportionately industries like retail and restaurant and hospitality. And on the flip side, the ongoing recovery has also really been limited to those who had temporarily lost their job. So what's happening here is there's a growing undercurrent of more permanent job losses that is taking up a larger portion of these blue bars, even though the blue bars are getting smaller. And this doesn't track precisely with our ESI trends, but it's a little more reflective of kind of the situation that's going on. And we've only been looking at this specific area or this kind of trend for a month or two, so there's a lot more to uncover. But we're continuing to work with new labor statistics data to further our understanding of this relationship, and there will definitely be more to come on this front. So with that, I will turn the reins over to Lauren, who's going to chat a little bit about Mass Health and Medicare.
Thanks, Greg. So for Mass Health, so members with primary coverage under Mass Health increased 9.9% between March 2020 and September 2020. This graphic does not show that specific increase, but what this graphic shows is that the increase in this time period is largely due to the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which mandated, it's a federal legislation that mandated, among other things, that Medicaid programs across the country, so including Mass Health, that they continue coverage during the pandemic. So as of March 18th, throughout as long as the pandemic is a pandemic, that basically Medicaid programs, usually they do redeterminations each month. If someone doesn't qualify anymore or has circumstances change, then they would be disenrolled. So the FFCRA just said, during the pandemic, everyone keeps their coverage no matter what. So what happens then is that the normal sort of, people sometimes call it churn, people come onto the rolls of Medicaid, people fall off. So that has not happened. There are fewer people are disenrolled per month since that legislation passed. So what this graphic is actually showing is, so in the dark blue is new members each month, starting back in August 2019, sort of pre-pandemic, all the way through to August 2020. So you see that the new members each month actually are fewer than months past or pre-pandemic, if you will. And then the gray bar below that are disenrolled members. So you see that prior to March 2020, there's a fair volume of members being disenrolled each month due to usually redeterminations. And then as of April 2020, that number of people being disenrolled each month is it's not zero, but it's a lot fewer. So the reasons for some people still being disenrolled are voluntary disenrollment, people moving out of state, people passing away. But what this graphic is intended to show is just that is basically the effect of the federal legislation on Medicaid enrollment. And you're also seeing this in other states. It's not just Massachusetts, but so not only have there been fewer disenrollees, but there's also been fewer new enrollments each month. So, so that's that. So I guess next slide. And then switching over to Massachusetts Medicare enrollment. The interesting finding here was, so Medicare generally, grows steadily at roughly, 1.5 to 2% annually. And in our data, there was actually a pause in the growth of Medicare enrollment in the second quarter of 2020, specifically in May 2020. There was actually a decline in membership, and that coincided with the pandemic's highest mortality rates in the Commonwealth, which, as we all know, were very much concentrated in older populations. And then, enrollment picked back up in the third quarter of 2020. So that's just kind of showing graphically, which is pretty significant, we thought. It's pretty stark. And so luckily that trend is kind of turning around. So that's Medicare. And so as far as next steps, we are continuing along with our monthly enrollment monitoring. We're projecting doing a publication late December of data through October. We are also continuing with our biannual enrollment trends data. The next edition of that with data through September 2020, we usually publish that in February. So even though it's not as recent data, it's a much deeper dive. So that one is by payer, by group size, it's a lot more detail. So that one will actually, I'm interested to look at the data for that because that will be including 6 months of the pandemic. That should be coming out in February 2021. And we're continuing to coordinate and consult with other agencies that have both programmatic and oversight roles in the market. And I believe that concludes the presentation, but we are here to take questions.
Lauren, quick question for you. This is Bill again. I think in this report, or maybe it's in something else that I saw, we published and have been tracking the percent uninsured in the state. And so remind me what that looks like in particular, how recent you have that data.
So actually, Christine might actually be able to speak to that. So our unit doesn't report that, but the latest one, Greg, do you know off the top of your head? I think it's for 2018 is the most recent data we have.
Yeah. We'll look up the year, but I think, there's a temptation, and we note this in this enrollment style reporting, to kind of draw conclusions about what the uninsurance rate is. And it's a fair kind of assumption to make. I do know that the process for actually measuring the uninsurance rate is a really rigorous survey process. And as a result, it's done less frequently. I could see, if there were, temporarily uninsured for a couple months, in the spring or summer, I could see potentially these surveys not capturing that data, depending on kind of the cadence that they run. So it is definitely a potential blind spot with how rapidly this hit.
Right, but in general, yeah, so our enrollment data, and I don't know how often the federal government does enrollment data, but it's based on a very, very thin sample set in Massachusetts, and it's not good enough if you really want to understand the details of the insured and underinsured and uninsured population. So that's what our survey does, but it's only every other year. So it's not in any type of it's not a close monitoring, but every other year we do, an extensive, elaborate survey, a household survey. And from that, we get a much, much more detailed picture of insurance coverage and uninsurance in Massachusetts. So we use that as kind of the, we consider the most accurate number, and track that, year over year. And then in particular, we use that survey to get behind the number in terms of where are the unemployed, what are their demographic characteristics. The connector is very interested in that work because it lets them understand, for instance, if it's a particular linguistic subgroup, things like that, because I think we ask about primary language. And so that's right, but it is only every other year type of deep dive that we do into the household insurance market in Massachusetts.
Got it. Yeah, no, that's very helpful. When you think about kind of budget priorities going forward, is that something you might want to accelerate in terms of the frequency?
Yeah, I think I think there's so many candidates for acceleration. It's a little like there are pretty much everything, as you saw, the case mix, hospital financial data, payer aggregate. I mean, I guess not payer aggregate data, but across most of our data assets, we've been accelerating. But then there's also a point where you have to stop and ask why you're doing it. So for instance, monthly hospital financial data, we've been collecting that on a voluntary basis. And there have been some people saying, well, why don't you make that mandatory? The issue is that the monthly view is only a monthly snapshot. It doesn't show year to date because the hospitals aren't able to pull together a year to date picture on a monthly basis for us. So you're not really, I mean, what would be better is if we could turn around the quarterly reports faster, probably. I mean, we're doing the monthlies, but we actually think where you would settle if you kind of could figure out what you really wanted to do to understand the hospital financial condition is probably the quarterlies done faster. And then maybe if there's a subset of hospitals you're concerned about, you do some more closer monitoring of them. But the right answer probably isn't forcing the entire system to do these accelerated monthly reports. So we're in the process of trying to understand. I think some of the things we've accelerated, we may back off on. I think some of the things we haven't accelerated, like household surveys, maybe we do need to do those more often, or maybe we need to do we've talked about a new household survey getting at more health equity issues. I mean, it already gets at a bunch of health equity issues, but we've considered whether we should do more. So I think I think it was Laura used the term at an inflection point. I really think CHIA, we can't come out of this just doing the same old. I think as busy as we are, we've got to think strategically about, what the world needs from CHIA in the future. Faster data is certainly one of the things. Some of the times, like I said, with the household survey, it's really the delays are inherent. It's very hard to get around them unless you were sort of to just survey more frequently. But anyway, these are the types of, and I would like to sort of engage the council more in these discussions. The statute does talk about the CHIA's analytic agenda. I think this is one of the areas where it's kind of high level enough and strategic enough that we can engage the council, rather than tactical decisions that we make all the time about which of the data assets we should be leveraging, most frequently.
Ray, have you ever thought potentially about like other state data assets, like maybe outside of the healthcare space that might give you some of this demographic information, like partnering with like the Department of Labor or like some of the other executive branches that you might be able to connect into their work, because you guys already have these great joining algorithms, these great matching algorithms. You might be able to suck up different demo data as well,
It's an excellent thought. Well, we had a work group, our strategy and research team, Zi Zhang, not the head of the group, but lead researcher here, pulled together a group of folks from a bunch of different agencies in state government and also from the hospital community to look at social determinants of health. And it was in the context of readmissions and how we could come up with a way to control for social risk factors when measuring readmissions. But we were also conscious that it was an overall framework for what data do we have at our disposal and how could we link it to case mix, and in this case, case mix. But so that, for instance, information about food scarcity. We don't know that about individuals, but we know it about zip codes. So we said, well, okay, is that information we could get from census data and link it to the zip code? So we could start enriching our data, not just with patient information, but with some of this social information. So anyway, we did do a bunch of work about what is available to us in using state data and other state agencies. I will say one of the more exciting possibilities, but we haven't gone that far with it, but we'd like to, is the possibility of getting income data from the Department of Revenue.
Yeah.
The problem is they can't share it, because that's so powerful if you could understand people's, because that's such a powerful driver of people's circumstances. The issue is DOR can't share income data. But we did have a conversation with DPH, DOR, CHIA, and a few others about using cryptography and keys and hashing and possibly getting them to pass back to us income bands for individuals. And the truth is, events overtook us. We've been too busy. They've been too busy. Those conversations haven't gone any further. But I think that type of a possibility exists, to use our linking technology to actually start pulling data in from other state entities, including some really sensitive stuff like potentially income bands.
Right. That's what I was thinking, because I was wondering if your hashing technology and your join technology actually kind of gets you around some of those regulations and laws, because like you're de-identifying it on the way in. So are they actually sharing person level income data, or is that like
Right. In the healthcare side, we've generally, and DPH really as the hub with this public health data warehouse, the Chapter 55 opioid work that they did first, and then the public health data warehouse, they've been, putting that to the test of, can this data be shared if it's de-identified? And generally speaking, we've been able to get around, as long as there are agreements in place around, not using it for certain purposes, not trying to re-identify, not further sharing it, so on and so forth. They've been able to get around just about every obstacle. DORs, of course, outside of the healthcare space, they're operating with entirely different federal restrictions that we're not familiar with. So, I don't want to prejudge if we can get there with them. But in the healthcare community, this working with de-identified data, the way CHIA de-identifies it, has allowed us to get around almost all the legal obstacles we've encountered. Almost all.
Ray, I completely concur that this would be a really useful strategic discussion to have here at this level, and thinking a little bit about how do we gauge the worth of the reports and the information that we produce, the services that we provide, bringing that to bear in terms of a decision criteria to say there's a great demand for this, lesser demand for that, but at the same time, also thinking forward to what does the world need that they haven't yet known to ask for, that we're thinking about. Just thinking, Rob, on your comments, that sort of sparked my thinking around some people don't ask for things because they don't think they're possible. So we might also want to have a conversation around what kind of data, if we found a creative, really useful way to get at it, what does the world need, or what does Massachusetts need in order to better take care of its citizens? So I think this is excellent fodder for a strategic discussion at this level.
Excellent,
Right.
I agree.
Yeah, because I've seen, in my work at the auditor's office, I've seen so much data that the state collects, and honestly, I listened to some of the survey questions that you guys are asking. I'm like, oh, this so-and-so has that, I just feel like, I actually almost wrote my capstone on this for grad school, but I digress. But like, I do feel like there's a big opportunity, especially with that technology, Ray, to join a lot of these things together and get some really great insights. And yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. So actually, technically, we're still on question and answer with Greg and Lauren, right? If I'm not, yeah. All right.
But you can
Any
open
other? Right. Well, good work, folks. Understanding enrollment, and actually, no, I do have one last question before we move on, and it's unfair because I think. You can't answer it, and so I probably shouldn't put you on the spot that way in an Oversight Council meeting, but I think we just have to start asking the question kind of all the time, which is the health equity lens. So, okay, so we measure enrollment. It's not the type of data that off the bat lends itself to race and ethnicity breakdowns, and then we're a state that has very high, kind of enrollment, like we don't have to deal with it. We look at the demographic characteristics of the uninsured, but I don't know, is there anything we should be doing more, we could be doing around the race and ethnicity in the enrollment space, the movement between enrollment types? Put out a report on, I don't know, I don't want to prejudge, but just, I think we should always have to ask the question, can we be doing more in this area with race and ethnicity or healthcare equity? So any thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, it's, getting to that level of granularity, particularly at like the overall market perspective is really challenging. But I think, with the APCD, which is where a lot of this is sourced from, obviously there's a fair amount of information in there. The race and ethnicity information is not as good as the case mix. But we do have, regionality. We have a lot more information beneath kind of what we're summarizing with this. So there are definitely opportunities to do that. I'm hesitating only because it's a lot of work. Which is,
yeah, I mean more the art of the possible, like blue skying. I'm not saying we're going to be held accountable.
That's good. Like we want to do that. Obviously, I think currently our mind is in like just piecing together these monthly things because they're, hopefully helpful and important, and they're something we are able to do. But with these, obviously the questions get to like much more levels of detail is what people want to know and what we need to be producing. So I think, there's some stuff to do on that front.
I would just add, again, it's getting at that data and rolling it up to an overall market perspective is is pretty difficult, particularly since, you know, even in the APCD, like the self-insureds, we get a lot of supplemental data that we piece together that doesn't necessarily have that data. So that would be another big piece. But I will say, you know, there are like subsets of data that we may be able to dive deeper, but it wouldn't be necessarily a statewide view. For example, the Mass Health data that we received is pretty detailed, both on income and
right.
race and ethnicity. But again, that is a subset. It's an important subset, but it wouldn't be necessarily tracking across the whole state, and definitely with the commercial market. But I mean, to answer your question, there's always more we could do. It's just a matter of, you know, kind of seeing what makes sense and what is possible given what we currently have access to. So.
And Ray, one of the things I think you're onto there, of course, is it would be great and increasingly important. Never mind, it's super important today, but it's only going to get more important if we could be a leader in social determinants of health. I mean, that's kind of that's what you're touching on, right? And so race, ethnicity, income, food insecurity, housing insecurity. I mean, they're all the factors that we all know, and the importance that they play, and inseparable from, you know, a lot of kind of what we're seeing. So we're barely doing a superficial skim dive in that area, right? So that would be an interesting thing to talk about.
Absolutely. Well, and maybe if I don't want to put Eric on the spot, but because it was more Sandy from the Attorney General's office, but their report calls for, I believe, you know, some form of an annual report on health equity. And I think that the concept of benchmarking it, and, you know, no, it's harder to benchmark than total healthcare spending because that everything reduces to $1. And so it's like, it's a little more challenging to think about what would the benchmarks be. But I think that idea of coming up with some, you know, clear and objective measures and measuring them over time and being able to look at trends and such is the type of thing that we ought to be thinking about and doing. And like I said, the world's going to push us, either we're going to get there or the world's going to push us to get there. So we should be starting to think about it. But Eric, anything you can or want to share about the Attorney General's agenda?
No, I think you summarized it well on the data side. I mean, I think, you know, there are lots of places where we can do more with data to push the importance of health equity. And one of them is around benchmarking particular objectives on a statewide basis. So I know that our teams had conversations with you and your team, Ray, and we're having conversations with folks at the HPC as well. And I know everyone's aligned on these issues. So we'll see what we can do.
Exactly. I think we're sort of seeing in the middle of the pandemic, it's been hard to get things to move, you know, as quickly as they perhaps otherwise would have. But I think we're seeing the HPC has made a major focus of this. The Attorney General has certainly. CHIA is. In fact, maybe Lois, I'll turn it over to you in terms of whether there's anything you, and once again, sorry to keep putting people on the spot, but I don't know if there's anything you want to say from the HPC's perspective on the health equity topic and, you know, kind of CHIA's role or anything we can do to support you.
No, just that our executive director and deputy executive director said today at our advisory council meeting just before this, which is that there's a huge opportunity for working together and aligning our work. And so, you know, exactly, Eric, we're looking forward to sitting down and discussing the number of recommendations you made and to share the work that we're doing internally to think about sort of developing a more focused framework that we can use across, you know, a lens across all of our work and to apply to every policy that we might recommend. We're applying it right now to the work we're doing on the research side, to designing investments that have the particular lens in mind when we're evaluating, you know, respondents and in how we're sort of framing up the investment program. So we're sort of like taking that look, and we want to share what we're doing. We think data is a big part of that, and we want to be, you know, for data that we use, our own data assets at the HPC, we want to be, you know, part of the solution. And we think, you know, and thinking strategically, because we recognize we can't get everything about like, what do we really need? Are there other ways to get things? How can we move forward, you know, in the most kind of efficient way around this work?
So, okay, I think you can expect probably the, members of the Oversight Council that this is something we'll be reporting back to you on, you know, kind of each and every time, and probably in a bit more of structured and focused way, because so far we haven't had as much of an opportunity to really come up with a framework for our thoughts, but we will be reporting to the Oversight Council on healthcare equity issues and how CHIA is going to be responding to them, and that'll be heavily influenced by what's needed by our sister agencies so that they can do their work. So you'll hear more about that from us in the future. So anything else for Greg and Lauren on the enrollment trends? No? Okay, well, hearing none, thanks to both of you for a great report. Much appreciated. I think I will turn it back. I think that's the final item on the agenda. And so Faye, I'll turn it back to you, or unless anybody has anything else for today's meeting.
Thank you, all the presenters. I want to follow up on Laura's thoughts of having the council, perhaps the next meeting, really dig into some of the questions that you're going to be wrestling with as well, of how to prioritize. It's not that we have a lack of interest, a lack of data, a lack of things we all want to study and do. What are the ones that are actually going to be operationalized at some point, or doable, or make a difference, and helping us think through that would be terrific. So use us, we are here. That would be terrific.
Excellent.
If I hear nothing else, do I hear a motion to adjourn?
Moved.
Second.
Thank you. Terrific. Have a good holiday season as everybody possibly can.
Thanks to all of you. Good to see you.
Thanks, everybody.
Great work.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good work.
Yeah, really nice.